Well, I have with me Dr. Charlie Self. He is no stranger to the Hills Church. Dr. Self, we are so honored that you've taken time. I know that you are actually out of state with your family this week, but you made time to chat with us. So thank you so much for being on the call today.
Well, I'm really grateful to be with our Hills family of faith and address what are some really important subjects and ideas so that we can serve God as we participate in the social world that we're in.
Yeah, I want to start off with a softball, an easy question right off the top. Can you give us a brief theology of governance?
Thanks. Well,
Easy.
let's do it in four parts.
Okay.
So, the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we call the Old Testament in the Bible, has the nation of Israel as God's elect given civil and ceremonial and moral laws to govern their existence. And they obviously, through much of their history, failed to live up to those high ideals in so many ways. And after the final exile to Babylon and during the Babylonian Empire in the 6th century before Christ, we have a complete shift and theologically in Scripture from God's people as sort of a civil nation to God's people as exiles and dual citizens in whatever location they find themselves in. And what's interesting is the influence of Judaism and later on that foundation, Christianity, is actually going to grow because of the scattering of the populace throughout the North African, Mediterranean, Southern Europe, and what we call Asia Minor or Turkey and beyond. So those difficult moments for God's ancient people become pathways for the engagement of God's people in the expanded Israel we call the church to be involved. The second phase are the teachings of Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament. And I'd like to just highlight four scriptures that can be really helpful to dig into. In Luke 20:20, the religious leaders think they're going to catch Jesus being a political rebel or a political sycophant, and he's neither, when they say, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus answers, well, whose picture is on the coin? And they said, well, Caesar's. And he goes, well, give to Caesar what you owe Caesar, but give to God what you owe God. So paying taxes and being a part of civil society peaceably, Jesus made it very clear that was acceptable, without, of course, sanctioning imperial Rome's paganism. This is followed through by Romans chapter 13, the first 8 verses. Paul gives a very extensive theology of governance where he says, insofar as a government is punishing evil and protecting the good and carrying out its God given functions, Christians should be good citizens of that government. Now, Paul himself is going to experience when a government doesn't do that well.
Sure.
And so there's a point of conscience there and a point where a government goes from being God's appointed entity for peace and becomes, something very negative. 1 Peter chapter 2, starting with verse 13, we see a similar kind of thing. Fear God, honor the king, pay your taxes. So there's a sense in which Christians are called to be excellent citizens. 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul says we should be praying for those in authority and we should respect those in authority. So there is a biblical theology of Christian citizenship. Now, the third phase I want to bring out to you is what we'll call most of church history. And this may surprise people because we usually have the Western narrative in our mind, but
Yeah.
most Christians for most of history have been minority groups in various nations. And
Mhm.
even when their kings or emperors or chieftains are Christian, they're not usually advancing the gospel by virtue of imperial decree or military might. And so Christians have always had tension, sometimes when their values and influence are positively received, there's more peaceable experiences. Other times they're persecuted by those in authority. And so that has been the story of Christianity for almost 2 millennia.
Yeah.
In parts of the world where Christian monarchs, and again, I want to be careful because there's all different varieties of governance, but where there are empires, sometimes the church has been received favorably, but there is always tension because even within ecclesial structures that cozy up to political power, there are still priests and prophets and pastors and others who are saying, hold it a minute, to be Christian, it does not mean to behave the way you're behaving.
Yeah.
So there's always been tension, and there should be, between Christians who are first dedicated to God's kingdom and then doing their very best to persuasively bring their values and ideas to a culture, to both evangelize and to influence culture. In the last 300 years, we have then a fourth phase, which is this interesting combination of Christian influence to make the world a better place and complete freedom of conscience and no theocracy. And I would consider this to be a huge advance, both of kingdom values, but also of human freedoms. And to be fair, there are both Christian leaders and non-Christian leaders that are at the very forefront of this, whether it's the American Revolution, the first part of the French Revolution, other changes both in Europe and beyond. Where there are Christian influences around the world today, there is a greater opportunity for freedom of conscience and a greater opportunity for pluralistic and democratic traditions to continue. But there's always going to be a certain amount of tension because of the necessity of wanting for all others the rights we want for ourselves. And
Yeah.
so if we want our own freedom to worship, we have to want that for our neighbors who see the universe differently.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful to bring in that historical perspective because I feel like in our moment as a country and within the church, we feel like this is like it's never been like this. We've never had this tension like we have now. But it makes me think when you mention this tension that the church has faced throughout history, like maybe we're not the anomaly that we think we are, and that the church has
No,
had these tensions for a
no,
long.
we're not. Bishop Ambrose, toward the end of the fourth century, forced Emperor Theodosius to kneel in the snow outside the church after he had massacred a bunch of Thessalonians to keep his power in that part of what is today Greece. And the emperor had to perform all kinds of penance, even though he was officially a Christian emperor. The bishop said, "You're not welcome around the table of the Lord with that kind of policy." Now that's an anomaly of its own,
Sure.
but there were other moments like that, and so the church has always had a prophetic witness to hold people accountable, first to their own faith and then to basic values. And in the last 3 centuries, the church has promulgated the notion of real freedom of conscience, because when there is a free market of ideas and a free market of religious opportunities, religious communities of all kind flourish as opposed to a state church. And this is why America is a more religious nation than Western Europe with its history of state churches.
Hmm.
And there's a deeper 20th century history behind that. Um, but it's important to see that. So conservative leaning or liberal leaning, whatever those words mean today, people who take their Christian faith seriously genuinely want that first freedom of conscience.
Yeah. No, that's good. And looking at history in the last 250, 300 years, what have been the different approaches of Christians to politics? Has there been any major shifts or major, uh,
Sure.
yeah, points of disagreement among Christians?
Well, borrowing from the work of both Reinhold and Richard Niebuhr from the 20th century, but also borrowing from Luther, Calvin, Augustine, and many other sages throughout our history, there's three tendencies Christians have when it comes to kind of engagement in the larger, and I'm going to say the larger social and political sphere. We're assuming, by the way, good citizenship, moral behavior, peaceable
Yeah.
relations with neighbors. But three kind of one is withdrawal. This would be an example of devout Quakers refusing to engage in the American Revolution, for example, as pacifists, and they continue to have a pacifist witness. Mennonite Christians would withdraw in the area, not all areas, but in the area of any kind of military engagement or government enforcement that involves the threat of violence. That's a point of conscience for some Christians. Others withdraw even more severely, and have their own economy. So, a second version is sort of, you use the term in our conversation, which I kind of like, a takeover. We'll call it neo-theocratic. You know, we wanna see every area come under Christ. We want to see Christ as Lord of all areas of society. If by Christ as Lord you mean by influence, persuasion, you mean by conversion, by conversation, that's a wonderful sense of wanting the goodness of the gospel to influence things, all the while allowing your Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu friend to go to their temples and mosques and carry out their lives peaceably. So that's the tension. And so there isn't much takeover anymore. I want to say this carefully, especially after the American Civil War and after both all of the European powers got rid of slavery, and with the rapid decolonizations of the 20th century, takeover really isn't an option for most Christians. In fact, people have heard the term Christian nationalism
Yeah.
thrown around quite a bit and often conflated with white nationalism. And just to remind everybody historically, Christianity was born at the convergence of continents and cultures. It remains a majority non-white religion through her entire history. She influenced European society, sometimes for good and sometimes ecclesial power being abused. She influenced the Americas, sometimes for good and sometimes that language being abused. But the actual percentage of people who are wanting some form of white or Christian nationalism or theocracy to be imposed is very small.
Mm.
And there's a big distinction between wanting to persuade people to be Christians. Obviously, that's our goal as believers, and persuade that Christian virtues can influence legislation and policy, prudentially, practically speaking. But that's very different from the imposition of a theocracy.
Sure.
And so I want to just make that so withdrawal, takeover, but by far the most nuanced, complicated, interesting category is engagement.
Yeah.
What does it mean for exiles who are first citizens of God's kingdom and secondly citizens of a given location? What does it mean to engage? And this is where, especially in the last 300 years, there has been some really positive developments of Christians and non-Christians leading the way to get rid of slavery, leading the way to prison reforms, factory reforms, child labor reforms, other things in the 19th and 20th century. Civil rights was not exclusively Christian, but very Christian oriented, such that again, secular friends, Muslims, Jews, and others joined Martin Luther King in that movement, culminating in both civil rights and voting rights acts of 1965. Um, that's an example of Christian influence without theocracy, without imposition. So, really, for this conversation, we want to talk about engagement. We want to talk about discerning, courageous, and wise engagement because we believe that the Holy Spirit, who lives in every believer, wants us to bring down payments of God's future kingdom, of justice, peace, and joy, down payments of reconciliation and peacemaking, down payments of the end of conflicts and peacemaking. So but those are something brought about by the virtue and the power of the integrity and incarnational witness of the church.
Yeah. I think you started to touch on it, but how should we think about politics today? There was a couple terms you just went through real quick,
Yeah.
but Could you hit on those?
Well, I think, remember, the word politics refers, and I'm not trying to be too technical here, but it refers to our public life and the good of the community. We have the word almost like a swear word now. That's
Yeah,
politics and those politicians. But what we're really talking about is our shared decisions for the common good. And in the American system, we have democratic tendencies, but we elect representatives. We don't vote on everything. We elect representatives to then enact what we consider to be policies rooted in our moral framework that makes sense. So Christians should be thoroughly engaged in caring deeply about who's in public places of influence. We can't all be experts on every topic,
sure.
that's for sure. And I'll talk about the problems of engagement, but we should care deeply about the common good of all around us. And so we need to get politics out of the realm of an epithet or a swear word and return it to the realm of, hey, how do we have a more flourishing society in my neighborhood, not just the nation, but in my neighborhood? How do we work together with the variety of domains God's ordained in the world to really make the world a better place? So Christians should engage. Now, there's a difference between engaging politically toward the common good and being ensnared by political ideology.
Mm. Okay.
And political ideology is when a particular framework, human framework, overtakes our Christianity. I'll give you an example so it's not just
Yeah.
kind of theoretical. Um, a Christian can say, on this particular area of medical care or this particular area of public education, I tend to lean a little bit more conservative, or I lean a little bit more toward the government engaging in that more actively.
Mm.
And by the way, I'm not using conservative or liberal as negatives here, but just as sort of descriptors.
Sure.
But there's a great difference between saying, out of my convictions and out of what I think is best, I'm going to kind of lean this way or that on this particular issue. That's different than being ensnared by liberalism or conservatism,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Okay.
being ensnared by a scorecard. So I'll give you a really personal example from my time in seminary in Berkeley, California.
Okay.
Most people have heard of Berkeley, quite a lively place for all kinds of movements.
Mhm.
And in one seminary class, we were studying some of Paul's letters, and it was a Master of Divinity class, people preparing for ministry. And I was the only student in the class that actually believed Paul wrote these epistles to Timothy.
Okay.
And people were stunned, like, and they had never met a Pentecostal intellectual. They had never met someone who was,
Yeah.
of my type.
Right.
And so I gave my historical and theological reasons for the authorship of Paul, but the questions started coming.
Mm.
Well, if you believe this is Paul, you must hate women because Paul tells women, and I said, no, actually, I think they can serve in any function God has for them. And my particular movement, and I'm very tender to the fact that our listeners come from every background. So I'm not promulgating, a denomination per se, but the particular movement I'm part of, we ordain women, and we think they can hold any office God chooses. Well,
Okay.
that shocked them. Well, oh, you must be for the death penalty then. And I said, well, actually, no, I'm not. It's applied so unjustly, disproportionately to the marginalized and the vulnerable. So we need a justice system. We need to protect society, but I'm not for the civil death penalty. And then they go, oh, but well, by the way, I am pro-life. But I'm pro-life from conception to coronation, and that means the poor and the broken and the vulnerable and the physically and mentally challenged and the aged as well as the unborn deserve dignity and care.
Yeah.
And one person said, I've never heard this before.
Mm.
But you see, I wasn't fitting their scorecard,
Yeah.
the conservative or liberal scorecard. And I'm not here saying my opinions are the only ones Christians can have, by the way, but rather we have to be so careful that words that end in ism
Hmm.
don't overtake our theology.
Yeah, yeah,
And so I think there's room for Christians to really have lively conversations, prayer, discernment on how best to achieve the public good on a completely biblical and moral foundation.
yeah.
I think there are some things that are really absolutes for Christians, but I think there are other things that we have room to really discover. In fact, the modern welfare state wasn't dreamed up by Marxists. The modern welfare state came about in the late 19th, early 20th century by Western European Christian leaders saying nobody should die hungry, cold, and alone.
Mhm.
And so the idea of healthcare or old age pensions or retirements for factory workers, yeah, there were secular folks on the left that were for this, but there were a lot of churches and Christians coming at it from a completely different angle that said this is a good thing.
Yeah.
And now we can argue about the apparatus of all that today and how things should be done, but it's really fun to look at the history of Christian engagement and realize, wow, we've been at the forefront of almost every positive social change
Hmm.
all the way into the 1960s. So from the mid 17th century, when the religious wars finally ended and different movements were allowed to express themselves, for 300 years, there's a very positive record, as well as the great failures regarding slavery and segregation, or some other great failures regarding peacemaking in wartime. The two greatest failures of Western Christianity had to do with the American church refusing to, or dividing over and refusing to engage the slavery issue
Mhm.
and the segregation issue. And it cost us a civil war, and it cost us another century of real challenge, and the failure of the churches in Europe to bring peace at the beginning of World War One.
Mhm.
And you can watch the end of serious Christian influence in Europe come as these Christian nations destroy each other in 1914. And even with 500,000 troops coming out for a truce at Christmas, imagine if they had refused to go back to their bunkers. Imagine the impact of what, but the failure of church authorities and the failure of Christian leadership in these areas. We have to own that history, but we can also own a lot of other history that's much more positive.
Yeah, yeah. That's a lot. It's a lot. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant, trying to take in and process. I'm glad this is recorded, even for myself, so I can go back and watch it again and pull out different pieces of what you're saying. Um, so that if you're talking about engagement, I guess one just kind of general question for all Christians is what's my responsibility to vote? Like,
Yeah, it's a great, I think it is
oh,
our responsibility to vote if we care about the public good. God has ordained different forms of government. Like, it's by forms here, I'm referring to local, state, national. He's ordained government to carry out the welfare of her citizens. And we have a hand in seeing that carried out well or poorly. So to disengage, and I'm not talking about a complete matter of conscience. I can understand where somebody might not be involved in some particular issues or in a particular candidate. So I want to be very tender here. But if we don't engage, remember, always winsomely, and I wrote down a couple words here. We want to engage with courage, with wisdom, with kindness. Um, and I'd like to bring up something that I hope people will actually take notes on, because if I were to stand up on a mountaintop and want to address all public-minded people in our country or world, I would say that we need a conversation around three key words. What do we prohibit? What things are devastating to human flourishing that we don't want to see, regardless of our religious affiliation, our political leanings. Then, secondly, and this is the larger category, what should we permit, whether we agree or not? This is true toleration.
Mm.
Toleration is not agreeing. Toleration is not promoting. It's saying you see that issue differently,
Yeah.
and we're going to be good neighbors as best we can. We're going to be good neighbors. So I've lived around neighbors whose lifestyle arrangements are very different than mine. And in our culture, they are permitted to arrange their lives differently, to live their lives differently, provided it's nonviolent, peaceable, etc. Well, that doesn't mean I agree with them,
Mhm.
but here comes the next word. So you have what do we prohibit? What do we permit? And then finally, what do we promote? And what's happened in the last 10 years is we have forgotten the difference between permit and promote,
Mm.
especially when it comes to issues of identity, lifestyle, sexuality. And I'm saying this again, understanding that I'm an exile, that I may even be a minority as a Christian in a pluralistic world. But it's one thing when someone says, what do you think of a particular lifestyle? And I said, well, that's contrary to my faith,
Yeah.
but that's my neighbor made in the image of God. So I'm going to be a good neighbor. And if I have an opportunity, I'm going to share Christ, and we may even debate that behavior or that idea or that issue.
Mhm.
But you see the wisdom and nuance there gets lost because, and this has actually happened to me, because of my engagement with public issues the last 20 years, my engagement at the forefront of family structure and other areas. Um, I've been called intolerant, I've been called an inquisitor, I've been called a person who foments violence.
Mm.
And what's so funny is I've never been anything but positive toward everybody I've met.
Yeah.
But when they find out I have a moral conviction on a particular way of living, so we have to have this conversation. And Christians, I think, when we can get the distinction between, yeah, there's a wide range of permitted activities, just don't demand that deeply religious people promote them.
Mm.
On the other hand, we've had in the last 20 years an acceleration of almost universal prohibitions being reconsidered.
Mm.
And so we have to do some discerning here, especially in light of technology, especially in light of artificial intelligence and how we program that. And by the way, I'm not against technology or all forms of AI, but in light, we have to have a conversation over what are the values and virtues that are going to govern our, um, the way in which we live together peaceably.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if somebody finds out, for example, that I disagree with a Muslim on a particular theological, well, that wouldn't be a surprise. We have two very different religions.
Right. Right.
That's my neighbor. That may be, and that may be a friend, but I'm not an Islamophobe for disagreeing with how a Muslim understands Muhammad or their history, any more than I'm anti-Semitic if I disagree with how a Jewish person sees the world. Um, but what happens is the polarization that's been accelerating since the 1970s and in hyperdrive the last 25 years, that polarization makes this kind of thinking rare.
Yeah.
And honestly, Pastor, I'm hoping this video and our conversations can make genuine um, discernment, thoughtfulness uh, more normal, both in the church and beyond.
Yeah. Why do you think you started to touch on polarization in the last 40 years. Why are we so polarized?
I think there's and it's been accelerating, but I think there's two reasons for the polarization. One is the 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 ideological captivity, um, and that kind of instantly having a more extreme scorecard for your side of things. If you just look at the votes, and I'm talking about in states as well as the federal government, if you look at legislation prior to 2000, you find all kinds of party crossover,
Mm,
depending on the particular piece of legislation, all kinds of cooperation, crossover, disagreements. But since 2000, you've had this, if you're not in lockstep with the party, you're wrong. And this is something very devastating to practical wisdom and proximate justice and kind of taking steps forward together. Um, in 1997, Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich and President Bill Clinton did a lot of negotiation, but they literally were the last time they balanced a budget.
yeah.
They got 4 million people off of welfare to work.
Mm,
They and part of it was Speaker Gingrich had a certain mandate within Congress. Clinton was under pressure because of some of his personal decisions, but they both couldn't achieve it alone,
mm,
and they had to together achieve something.
yeah.
But underneath it, for all the imperfections, and we can find many in both of those men, underneath it, they shared a common set of values. Now, they didn't live up to them completely, but they were at least informing how they went about doing things.
Mm,
I'm saying that as a historical example because it's been a long time, other than an immediate response to crisis, obviously. It's been a long time since that kind of, discussion and deliberation takes place. So, ideology. The other one is the information age makes reactions more important than reflection.
mm.
And
Say
this is,
say that
I'm
again.
going to say it again. The
Mm,
information age that's been exponentially growing since 2000, right? When the internet really becomes ubiquitous,
yeah.
makes reactions more important than reflection.
Mm,
So think about the immediacy of data versus researching a subject well. And what it's done, it's literally rewired brain waves. We see this as we've done neurological studies in populations who and where they get their information. Um, we've seen this with now a generation of students who grew up on screens and not writing
mm,
or opening books. It doesn't mean they're less spiritual or dumber or not better or worse, but there's literal differences in how the brain is wired when you are constantly exposed to data that's unreflective but reactive.
mm.
And so I wanted to share these principles for countering that. How do we become more thoughtful?
Yeah.
And by the way, the answer isn't to not take in data. The answer isn't to shut down our computers. But there's four things that I think are underneath everything we've been talking about today that I wanted to share.
Yeah.
And they come out of a reflection on Isaiah chapter 44. And in Isaiah 44, the writer is excoriating the people of God for their love of idols. And he's saying, look, you can't have the Lord God and idols. And he goes, and in the middle of this, he says, no one stops to think.
Mm,
With half this wood, I'm cooking my dinner, and the other half, I'm building an idol that I'm going to bow down to. And what he's really saying is, if you would stop and think about it, you'd see the stupidity of your idolatry.
right.
Well, that little phrase is amplified by St. Paul when he says, regarding sin, stay innocent, run away from sin, but in your thinking, become mature.
Mhm.
And so four things that I think are just have been, and I'm actually gonna. This is what my next book's gonna be.
Okay.
Number one is we have to process our reactions well. We all have first reactions to things. And by the way, I'm not talking about birthday parties or tragedies but talking about issues,
Yeah.
politicians, public figures. If I say, if I say, AOC, Donald Trump, Taylor Swift, um,
Oh boy.
Tim Tebow. Okay, just these are just personalities. Okay, these are people. Just saying those names, there's now reactions going on.
Yeah.
Okay,
Lots
the
of
point isn't we haven't sinned yet, but to not pause and reflect on our reactions. And as part of this processing our reactions, a little subpoint here, we have to evaluate words and actions, not judge people.
Hmm.
This is really important. So when somebody asks me, what do you think of, and fill in the blank of a person? My answer is always, well, what essay, article, speech, words, actions do you want me to evaluate?
Hmm.
I can't evaluate, I don't judge a person.
Hmm.
That's the prerogative of God.
That's good.
I can like and dislike. So processing our reactions, and it can be as simple as moving from negativity to intercession. So when a politician I don't agree with says something and I have a reaction, what I have to learn is that that reaction needs to turn into intercession for them.
Hmm.
And I've not contributed anything to the world if I just go online and say that person's a jerk.
Right. Right.
Number two, we need to consider our essential values or foundations. What is our framework? As Christians, we would say, what does the Bible say? What does Christian tradition say about that issue?
Okay.
Now, not every issue has a verse to it, but there's Christians have thought about these things.
Yeah.
Number three, we have to pursue good research. This is hard. We have to take time to make sure we see different perspectives and that the people offering them have some knowledge of them, whether it's through investigative journalism, research science, historical training. Now, a thoughtful person who's not an expert can still do something thoughtfully, but we want to pursue good research. And then number four, we want to present our considered opinions in a way that leaves room for dialogue, leaves room for continued growth where possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think this polarization, coming back to the original question, the polarization comes out of a reactive world instead of a thoughtful world. And it comes out of conscious and unconscious captivity to personalities and ideologies. Um, for example, there are people who so dislike the former president or the current president that they can't even evaluate a sentence that person says that might be true.
Yeah. That's
And there's reasons why people may not like the former president or the current president, but their sentences or even policies can still be good, bad, or in between. And will we become the critical thinkers that help people think through things?
yeah. So just the the process for how we should be thinking about politics. You said process our reactions well. That's the first one. Give me the second one more time.
Second one is ponder our foundations. In other words, what does the Bible say about it? In other words, what are our foundational convictions? Now, hopefully, as Christians, they come from Scripture and Christian tradition, but where do the Scriptures directly or indirectly address these issues?
Okay, so we
And
got
what have other thoughtful Christians said about them?
so those process, ponder, pursue, good research, present, considered.
Yes. And then present ideas in a humble way that there's room to grow, room for conversation where possible.
Yeah,
Now,
gotcha.
there are some issues that, however winsomely I present them, still may be filled with deep moral conviction that others will disagree with. So maybe there's a fifth point here, and that is you will not always be everybody's friend.
Well, that's the truth.
Get ready, get, but here's the question: are we being persecuted for real righteousness or persecuted for obnoxiousness? And so, if I have a moral conviction that I've thought through and presented, and people say no, I have to take that and not respond in the same spirit they give it to me. Um, but I have to take that. I have, to be Christian is to be contrary to the principalities and powers that are dominating a fallen world.
Yeah.
And that one of the reasons I trust the Bible is God's own ancient people failed all the time and had to be renewed and disciplined and renewed again. And so it's there can be humility and there can be tears and there can be a desire for the good of others underneath even the strongest presentation of a moral conviction.
Dr. Self, we're about out of time here. And we were chatting before we started recording, and there was one thing that you had mentioned about how it's possible for us as Christians to disagree.
Yeah,
I think you use the term prudential policies
yeah,
and still walk in unity about deep moral concerns. And that's part of what it looks like to be mature in our faith, to walk in unity, is that we have these differences, but we can still learn together. Um,
yeah. And I think just to amplify, you said it better than I did earlier, but to amplify this, unity is not uniformity. It's not it's what it is agreement on the essentials of our Christian faith and agreement that the person next to me is both created in God's image and in Jesus Christ a new creation and therefore worthy of dignity and love and respect. And when we have differences, by the way, this applies for friendships, marriages, this applies for everything. There are going to be differences, but do we put them in God's pending tray? Do we keep them outside our inner life and allow a rich inner life of love and respect? So if you and I were to talk for hours, we'd probably find 5 or 10% prudential disagreement on some things. I don't know of any, I don't have any in my brain, but let me just tell you how much I respect you in the Lord and how much I'm grateful to walk in unity with you to empower and equip and serve the church and serve our world. Um, Maturity is kind of living with those differences while we enjoy the deeper unity that Jesus died to create.
that's so good. That's so good. Dr. Self, as always, so appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness in all these matters. I always enjoy our time together and when we can catch up outside of church matters, just grabbing lunch. It's always so uh, it's more than just informative. It's more than just enlightening. It's good for the soul. It's good for the soul. So I appreciate your insight in these matters. And so thank you so much for joining us.
It's my great honor to be part of the Hills family, and let's continue to grow together.